But eventually, the push to reconstruct the social hierarchy of the South would come to an end. And there's a number of reasons for this. For one, the economy of the South didn't really develop so much throughout the period of Reconstruction, right? Many African Americans remained in poverty. And the new governments had tried to put money into the railroad system, trying to develop the economy, trying to attract more northern investors to build factories in the region, to create jobs. But northern entrepreneurs were more interested in developing in the West, not in the South. Okay, you're also going to see an increase in violence in the South, which is a reaction to Reconstruction policies and the rise of African Americans and the attempt to bring about equality, racial equality in the South. Okay, so there's a reaction to that. Okay, and so you're going to see a number of terrorist organizations rise up, in particular the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, so you're going to have terrorist organizations that are attacking African Americans and the Republican Party. Okay, and so they're going to be lynching and whipping African Americans, also white Republicans, people who supported the Union during the Civil War, Northern teachers who came to the South to participate in schools that were developing in African American communities, right? People who were just part of the Republican Party. These are the people who are being targeted by the KKK, right? Trying to use violence to push back the policies of Reconstruction. So the federal government has to do something about this. In 1870 through 1871, you have the federal government adopting three enforcement acts, okay, the enforcement acts. And this allows the president to use the army, the federal army, right, against any of these terrorist groups, okay? And it also makes these actions that the terrorist groups are doing, depriving citizens of their rights, right, their civil rights, their political rights, it makes that a federal crime, okay? It's not just a state crime anymore. So that's the enforcement acts. And so this is going to help to break up this first iteration of the KKK, right? At the same time, you have members of the Republican Party, all right, who was supporting Reconstruction and Reconstruction policy. You're going to have some members of the Republican Party feeling alienated. Okay, why? They're being alienated by the new president who's in charge at the time. As we get into the 1870s, we're talking about Ulysses S. Grant, right? You remember General Grant from the Civil War? Well, he becomes president. And his administration at the time is known for being corrupt, like heavily corrupt. And this is going to alienate a number of Republicans. And eventually they're going to form their own little breakoff party known as the Liberal Republicans. And you're going to start hearing racist ideology coming from the liberal Republicans, right? So they're moving away from Reconstruction policy. They're moving away from trying to bring about equality in the South. In 1873, the country is going to go into economic depression, right? The economy is struggling, and this is going to further take politicians' attention away from the Reconstruction policies that they were focused on before, okay? And you're going to start to see traditional Southern leaders or people, who supported the Confederacy start to regain political power in the South. And these individuals were known as redeemers, right? Well, they're claiming that they're going to redeem the South from this period of political corruption where Northerners and African-American political leaders had corrupted the politics of the South. Okay, so that's the perspective of these so-called traditional Southern leaders, right? People who supported the Confederacy, right? So they're starting to regain political power in states like in North Carolina and Texas. In 1875 and 1876, we're going to see an increase in violence in the South, right? More violence of traditional Southern leaders and people who support the Confederacy. They're trying to regain control, political control of the South, right? So these acts of violence are there to terrorize African Americans and Northerners who are there in the South, supporters of the Republican Party. Okay, and this time the Grant administration is not going to intervene, right? As we had seen before. And so you're going to see more attacks against African Americans, trying to stop them from voting, so that supporters of the Confederacy could gain political power once again. So in the election of 1876, right, you're going to see President Grant, his term's over, and it's time for a new president to step in. And the main candidates in this election are going to be Rutherford B. Hayes, who's the Republican candidate, versus Samuel J. Tilden, who's the Democrat. And it's a very close election, okay? So close that it takes a special commission to decide who actually won the election. And eventually the commission is going to choose Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, right? Just like how President Grant, he's a Republican, Lincoln's a Republican, okay? Just to give you an idea who the Republicans are at this time. So Hayes is going to win the election, but the Republicans have to make a backroom deal, right, with the Democratic Party, okay, in order for the special commission to agree that Hayes won the election. So a backroom bargain. This is the bargain of 1877. So what do the Republicans have to give up in order for Hayes, the Republican candidate, to win this election? Well, for one, the Republicans have to recognize that the Democratic Party has political control of the entire South. Okay, so this is referring to Reconstruction, meaning that Northerners and Northern politicians and Northerners who are traveling to the South and becoming politicians there, they need to get out of Southern politics and recognize that the Democratic Party controls the South, not Northern Republicans, right, who are moving to the South and gaining political power. Okay, so that's going to end. Right, and that's going to hurt Reconstruction policies, because now when the Democratic Party takes control of the South, they're going to be passing laws that are oppressive, that do not support equality. Another aspect of the bargain of 1877 is that the federal government can no longer interfere in local affairs. So the Enforcement Acts, right, which gave the president the right to send in the U.S. military, right, to stop terrorist organizations, that has to stop. And in fact, with this bargain of 1877, you're going to see the U.S. military forces being removed from pretty much most of the southern states, okay? Except for maybe a few. You might have like Florida, Louisiana. You might have some areas where military forces are still there. But for the most part, the troops are being pulled out, okay? And the troops were there to maintain a level of equality in Southern society. Another aspect of the bargain of 1877 is that Rutherford Hayes, right, the new president, he has to appoint at least one Southern Democrat to his cabinet, okay, and he does. A guy by the name of David Key, or David M. Key, he becomes the Postmaster General, okay. So these are all things that the Republican Party are giving up to the Democrats in order for Hayes to win the election, okay. Another aspect of the bargain is that the federal government is supposed to help fund another transcontinental railroad going through the South, right? So going, from Texas all the way to the Pacific coast. And so this is supposedly going to help the economy of the South, right? You got the railroad, you got the transportation, you eventually get more factories built down there. That's the idea. But that ultimately doesn't end up happening, right? Hayes doesn't give the federal aid to develop the railroad in the South. Okay. Now, on the other hand, the Democrats, they're supposed to respect the civil and political rights of African Americans, right? That's also part of this agreement, a part of this bargain. But ultimately, Democrats do not respect the political and civil rights of African Americans, right? And you're going to see the development of racist and oppressive legislation there in the South. And so this brings an end to the period of Reconstruction, right? With the bargain of 1877, the rise of violence in the South, right? Economic issues that draw attention away from Reconstruction, and a change in attitude of Northern whites who no longer want to support equality for African Americans in the South. They feel that the South should just deal with its own issues and the federal government should not be involved.